Hi, my name is Jason Koff, and I'm an associate professor at Tennessee State University. Today I'm going to be talking about drone uses in agriculture, so the different types of applications that drones can be used for on the farm. So first off, I think most folks are familiar with drones. Basically, they started out as with a military application, but then they became smaller and cheaper, and they became more accessible to consumers. So there's a number of applications that they're being used for currently. Some of these include things like photography and filmmaking, real estate, search and rescue operations, construction, and also a multitude of different types of scientific applications. Now, sometimes you might see drones referred to as UAV or UAS. UAV stands for Unmanned Aerial Vehicles, and UAS stands for Unmanned Aircraft Systems. So, a few years ago, the American Farm Bureau Federation found that the return on investment for farmers using drones could be somewhere around $12 per acre of corn and between $2 and $3 per acre for soybean or wheat. There's not really been, uh, they didn't really look into anything related to animal production, but these returns on investment basically are going to be variable depending upon the different types of applications that the drone's being used for and the different types of drones and sensors and those kinds of things. So speaking about sensors, there's a number of different types of sensors that are out there. And obviously, they range in price. They can be fairly expensive. And in a lot of cases, there's other information that you can get from the drone where you don't necessarily need a sensor. So now I'm going to talk about some different types of research that's being done using drones to be able to get different types of information or data from the field, to be able to tell different things that you might want to know. So in this case, these researchers were looking at plant heights as they relate to yield. And this is looking at the plant biomass in a barley field. And so basically, they were looking at the barley in the field. So they were taking measurements directly of the barley. And then they were relating that to what they would see when they flew over it with a drone. Now, the images that you see here, basically the maps that are shown, aren't images that you would get just by taking pictures with the camera that comes with the drone. But with the images that you can get, there's data associated with the pixels that are part of that image. So, any image is going to have red, green, and blue values associated with it, along with some other information. And you can take this data for each pixel, and then you can use that to come up with some kind of an equation or an algorithm that's going to maybe be useful in being able to figure out different things that are out in the field. So in this case, that's what these researchers were doing, is they came up with an algorithm, and they were able to take that data that they collected from the images with the drone and come up with the maps that you see here. And so this is something that folks are doing in hopes of being able to create some sort of an application, like an app that a farmer could use that would make it easier. They wouldn't have to work with the equations or anything. It would all be done through the application that they have on their iPad or whatever mobile device they might be using. And so remember, with all this research that I'm talking about, they're not just kind of flying over the field and looking at the data. They're also relating that data to what they see on the ground. So they're doing what's called ground truthing, where they take the data from the drone and they compare it to the real data that's on the ground. And if they see relationships, then that's the data that they want to use. So you can look at a bunch of different data from pixels, like I mentioned, red, green, blue, but also other things that are attached to those pixels that come out of those images. Here's another example of using drones for collecting data on the ground. In this case, they were looking at soils and being able to map different soils for different characteristics. So the graphs that you see on the top, that center column, and then also the right-hand column, these are basically looking at different soil characteristics. So these top two basically relate to the organic matter that's present in the soil. And then the middle two relate to the pH that's present. And then the bottom two relate to the potassium level in the soil. So you can see, once again, you can get some information. With this case, in this case, they were looking at just the blue light that the drone was able to capture. In most cases, this could be something where they used a sensor to be able to capture some of that blue wavelength of light. And then they were able to relate this to actual soil testing that they did in the field to come up with a relationship and be able to create some of these maps that you see here. So you can see this could be pretty useful in looking at, the soil across the field. It can be used to identify trouble spots, that where you might have low organic matter or low potassium, or the pH might be off. And then you can do further analyses from there after you've, taken the imagery from the drone. The picture on the left-hand side, this is actually a false color map. And so what they did was they were able to identify different areas that were affected by salts. And so the areas that you see here that are identified in like a whitish color, or have like a bluish color to them, those are soils that are being affected by salt. And so obviously those could be some trouble areas in the field. Weeds, of course, are an important thing that we want to try to take care of out in the field, preferably before they get too widespread. In this case, researchers were able to differentiate between the winter wheat that was grown in the field, which is identified by the green color here, and then also the weeds, which are identified by the yellow color. And so in this case, again, using a drone, being able to take that spectral data and analyze it, then you can create these kinds of maps. And so what this can do then is you can take these maps and you can apply variable rates of herbicides to take care of this, rather than applying kind of a one size fits all rate across the field. You can see down in the bottom here, they've got more of a variable rate where they pinpoint specifically where they need their regular dose of herbicide, and then some areas where maybe a lower dose is useful, and then areas where you don't really have to treat because there were no weeds found. This is just another example where some researchers are using sensors to identify weeds in the field. This is actually a sunflower field, and they used a multispectral sensor. So that's what you can see here in the top right-hand corner. They were able to use that to collect the wavelength or the light data to be able to create the equations or algorithms that were able to create these maps. So you can see here, the green areas are where the sunflowers rows are planted, and then the reddish areas are where the individual weeds are located. And so they were able to get pretty good accuracy, about 91% accuracy at about 50 days after planting. So this is when the plants are still small, the weeds are small, and that's really a good time because you want to get them before, obviously the weeds get too large and widespread. So this is another example looking at plant disease. So in this case, the researchers went out and they inoculated a field, and then they, in this case, they inoculated the field with downy mildew. And then they went back and they, after a period of time, they flew a drone over it, and they were looking to see what kinds of information they could get and then compare that to the exposure that they found on the ground. So the incidences of disease, the severity of the disease, those kinds of things. And then what they looked at was comparing different variables. So the top area, these top two graphs basically show they used different types of temperature data that they were able to get from the drone when they flew over it. And then this is an NDVI index. So this stands for Normalized Difference Vegetation Index. And this is a special index that's used a lot of times to help us look at vegetation and see how it's doing. And then this bottom two sets of graphs basically showed the ratio of two different types of light. So we're looking at green and red light, the ratio of those, and basically trying to identify if this is related to what was seen on the ground. And so the researchers found that the temperature data that you've got up here, and then the bottom graph here with the ratio data, those two actually lined up pretty well with some of the information that they saw on the ground. Here's another example, looking at irrigation. In this case, we're looking at drip irrigation for some citrus trees. You can see the trees identified as these small round circles here across the field. Basically, they flew over it. In this case, they flew over it with a thermal infrared camera. And so they were able to identify plants or trees that were hotter than others. And so when a plant or a tree is stressed, it's going to get hotter. Just like, you know, when you get sick, you run a fever, you know, you're going to be, you know, hotter than you normally would be. And so in this case, they flew over the field, and where you see that number 1 identified, basically they went back out and they found that there was a plugged drip line in that area, and that's why these trees were coming out red, because they weren't getting enough water. In this case, with this number 2 here, they had one of the lateral lines that came out from this irrigation pipe wasn't long enough, and so these trees in this area weren't getting enough water, so they were able to see that and then go in and correct the issue. Also, some folks are looking at using drones as applicators for herbicides. And so you can see that this is kind of a larger type of drone. In a lot of cases, since you've got all the water that's associated with the herbicide, that's going to weigh more. And so you're going to need a bigger drone to be able to carry all that cargo or all that payload. So in this case, this drone was able to apply an herbicide in a 100-foot swath to a 35-acre area at a rate of 4 ounces per acre. So, you know, at low rates, this might be, you know, a potential possibility. But at higher rates, you know, it might not work out so well. Other people are looking at actually using a multitude of smaller drones that are basically flown across the field in tandem, that are applying, you know, some of these pesticides to the areas. So some different things going on there. Predation, there was actually a study looking at if drones could prevent birds from attacking some of these oilseed plants. And so they found that the rotor type drones were able to, most likely because, you know, they're usually a little bit louder, they create a little bit more wind and those kinds of things. And so this is a problem in places like North Dakota, where they grow a lot of these sunflowers, and these red-winged blackbirds can cause about $3.5 million worth of damage. Here in our area, we get a lot of damage from wild hogs. The TWRA, the Tennessee Wildlife Resources Agency, estimated in 2015 that we had about $26 million worth of damage. So a significant amount, and you can see in this picture, you can see the amount of damage that was found across this field. So some researchers at Mississippi State University, they've used drones to try to identify the damage and then differentiate it from other kinds of damage that might be out in the field. So you see that damage caused by farm machinery. And they were able to, just using the simple camera, the RGB red, green, blue camera that comes with the drone, they were able to identify and differentiate that damage that was out there. And it had about a 78% accuracy. And the biggest thing was that the time savings factor. And I think with drones, that's one of the biggest factors with using a drone, whether you're using sensors or not, being able to reduce the amount of time where somebody has to get out there and just kind of scout the field. And so they were able to assess a 10-acre field in a few hours rather than, a week that it would normally take. Also looking at forestry, so uh, being able to identify the height of a tree, the volume of the tree, and then over time being able to look at the growth of the tree is really kind of some of the factors that we could use drones for. In this case, the researchers again were just using the normal camera that comes with the drone, and they were able to create these maps. And so knowing the size of the tree can help you with making management decisions like pruning and fungicides, being able to be more efficient in some of those things. And then looking at over time how the tree changes, you can identify certain trees that maybe aren't growing as quickly, and be able to, try to figure out why that is. Herbicide drift. So we've got a lot of things going on with dicamba drift out in the field, and so this is another area where people are looking at using drones to be able to identify some of these things. So in this case, this is an NDVI map. So I mentioned NDVI before. It was an index that's used a lot of times to look at vegetation, and in this case, these folks were able to identify herbicide drift. It's basically the red and orange colors that you see out in the field. So there's a lot in this area of the field. So that indicates they found that indicated a lot of herbicide drift based upon what they saw out in the field, as well as what they found just from the drone imagery. And then also looking at nutrient management, being able to take some images of plants that are growing out in the field and figure out, based on what you get back, how much fertilizer you need to apply to keep them, healthy and maintain good yields. So in this case, the study was looking at different rates of fertilizer that were out in the field, comparing it to what the farmer was applying. And then they would fly a drone over it and then calculate based on again, you can see this is an NDVI. In this case, this is NDRE, so it's a little bit different from the NDVI that I mentioned before, but it's sort of the same sort of concept where you're using some sensors to be able to figure out some of this information. So in this case, using this information to prescribe how much nitrogen needs to be applied in the middle of the season. And so based on this, you can see the left-hand image is essentially the image that you would get if you were just flying over and taking a picture. And so you can see there's not much variability there. But then when you use that index, then you can actually start to see some differences across the field. And then these can relate to how well the plants are doing, and then indicate, about how much fertilizer needs to be applied. And so what they did was they were able to see and prescribe different rates of fertilizer based on what they saw in those images. So you can see there's kind of a range of nitrogen rates across the field here, and that makes things more efficient. This was able to save about $3 per acre as compared to the farmer applications, because they were able to reduce across the field, they were able to reduce the overall rates of nitrogen that were being applied. And so again, just looking at a lot of times, you can see some of these things just by looking across the field. You can obviously see a lot of differences. You can identify some trouble spots. And so that can save some time rather than just kind of going randomly across the field to try to find something. You can pinpoint specific areas and then go out there and, maybe soil sample or see if there's any sort of disease or insect problem. I know in talking to a crop scout, they use these a lot for insurance purposes. If there's been, a flooding event or a hail or wind event, they can fly over the field and identify specific areas, and then guide the insurance adjusters when they come out. They can guide them to those specific spots in the field. And then, the crop consultant that I talked to, he said that's actually been able to save them more money by being able to show them those trouble areas. So this is just another example. This is a situation where there was irrigation issues out in the field. And then if we're looking and we're talking about animal production, then of course being able to use a drone to check on animals, check on water sources, also check fence rows. These are some different things that they could be pretty useful for. And farmers have used these before, and they've really been helpful in reducing the amount of time that it takes to do these tasks. And so, because of that time savings factor, then you can actually do more monitoring more often. And so that can help to reduce the overall mortality of the animals in the field, because you're able to, you know, check on the animals and ensure that there's no animals in distress or anything like that. So that's basically it for the different types of applications. Obviously, this is a new technology that's out there, so there's always going to be new discoveries and new ways to use drones. And so the idea, though, is that some of this research that's being done now is going to be able to be turned into, like I mentioned before, an app that you put on a mobile device, and then you can use that out in the field, and then get a lot more information than you might normally have. And then with that, basically, I've got my contact information. If anybody has any questions as a result of this video or wants to get in touch with me relating to additional information, you can definitely reach out to me either through email or on Twitter at TSU Bioenergy, and I'd be happy to help you out. All right. Thank you very much.